Talking about The Forbidden Universe, a book that traces how modern science really goes back to the worship of the occult. I say worship, meaning that the Hermetica was a book of religious concepts, a book which was suppressed because of its religiosity. The Hermetica, inspiring all of the modern forefathers of science, long before there could be foremothers, as it were. And that type of magical thinking still pervades science to this day. The Forbidden Universe, the occult origins of science and the search for the mind of God. I was reminded of that as I was reading this book all throughout the week, and I was getting regular updates on the final trip of the space shuttle, and just how magical really the space shuttle is too. When you think about it, just the idea of interplanetary travel, just anything outside of our own atmosphere is amazing and owes itself to this book, The Hermetica. Next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. I was interested to learn about the Hermetica in this new book, The Forbidden Universe. And Lynn and Clive, I will tell you, I didn't realize that it's generally this book that credits our popular expression, the summation of the earth being earth, wind, fire, and water, that is generally thought of as being a hermetical concept, which we now just think of it without a second thought. But earth, wind, fire, and water are coming out of the Hermetica. Does that sound right to you?
Yes, it does. Many of the sort of the esoteric concepts we take for granted come from the Hermetic works. Another example is as above, so below, that saying that you hear all the time.
Right.
That's a Hermetic kind of motto. So the Hermetic is really kind of the core of sort of the Western esoteric movement. It's not so that's the only thing in there. There are other things like the Kabbalah and things sort of in there. But the thing that holds it all together is this kind of magical philosophy that's found in the Hermetic books.
And actually, when you think about it, the Hermetica is a kind of bridge between what you might call forbidden religion and forbidden science. And the bridge is the Hermetica equals magical thinking.
Well, and so I was thinking about that this week as the space shuttle went up, and I was thinking about how just even how unbounded one's imagination would have to be to create that type of science. And in its own way, it reflects a time when that would have been considered purely magical thinking anyway. And if somebody had been proposing that type of rocketry or building rockets, very likely would have gotten them burned at the stake at one time or another anyway.
But it does show another Hermetic principle, which is, what a miracle is man. Instead of saying we're all sort of worms destined for hell, we can do anything as long as our minds are unlimited.
And that was a core Hermetic belief, which we take for granted today. The idea that we are ourselves a kind of miracle, the miracle of the human brain, the miracle that, whatever we do as humans is worthy of study, and we have whole universities set up for that. But what other ways do you trace? I mean, we things that happen in science today, and you trace them back to this original occultish, magical thinking, which got sort of jump-started the Renaissance?
What we're really finding is that science now is rediscovering that philosophy, that attitude. There was a big split. As we said, everyone from Copernicus to Newton was directly inspired by the Hermetic books. The scientific revolution was actually the revolution of Hermetic science. But around about Newton's time and just thereafter, the two sides got split. The magic went one way and the science went the other way. Science in the sense that we really understand it today, this kind of rational logical approach to things, this kind of very mechanistic approach. The two split apart for reasons of just pure historical expediency because of the religious wars that were going on at the time. And that's when science began to downplay the magic. In fact, the term, that was the period when the term occult became a kind of pejorative term, and it specifically meant hermetic. It was a synonym for hermetic. Occult at the time. The Hermetic philosophy was sometimes also referred to as the occult philosophy, purely meaning hidden or secret. And the whole reason that we have this the term occult is a horrible term to use now because it's so loaded and means so many things to different people. But the whole reason that it becomes this kind of insult comes from this period where the magic went one way and the science went another. And for a while, for a long time, science went on its own way, through the 19th century when you've got these kind of great nuts and bolts type discoveries and, people building steam engines and that, and just using pure logic, pure mechanics to do things. Up until about 1900, this argument that actually science was better off without the magic because that was sort of holding it back might have held up. But during the 20th century, as the science began to look further out into the universe and further, deeper down into the workings of matter and the subatomic particles and then leading into quantum physics, that kind of mechanistic view has gradually fallen apart. And the things that science is now dealing with, particularly at the quantum level, fit very well into the philosophy, the magic of the Hermetica. That's what the second part of the book is about. The first part is about the history of the scientific revolution. The second part is really arguing that if those two sides had never split apart, if Hermetic science had remained Hermetic science, then essentially scientists wouldn't be as puzzled by some of the things that they're struggling with at the moment. They would actually take these things for granted because they're completely predicted in the Hermetic books. So if that thinking and philosophy had never changed, we'd probably be a lot further on than we are.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was actually going to ask, so where do you see evidence of that original Hermetic thinking in modern science, and where don't you see it?
It's particularly...
Oh, this was for Lynn. That was for Lynn. That was my question for Lynn.
It's kind of accidental. It's basically modern science, specifically quantum physics, is catching up with the Hermetica, unknowingly, very largely. Certainly, we don't know of any major scientists who will come out and say we are Hermeticists. And it's notable, actually, that the crusading atheists tend to be in the biological sciences, which is much more nuts and bolts. The physicists, cutting-edge physicists, they have very wild concepts, at least apparently wild concepts. Certainly when they're studying subatomic particles, the way they behave, and the whole idea of consciousness. There was an American physicist called John Archibald Wheeler, who had what sounds like a completely mad idea, but he's taken very seriously, which is that by observing the universe, we are creating it. It's the idea of it's called a participatory universe. The idea of the participatory universe, in which human and other intelligent creatures, the whole consciousness together is actually creating the universe, and that is pure Hermeticism. One of the treatises I'm reading from notes here is God makes eternity, eternity makes the cosmos makes time, time makes becoming, and becoming is consciousness. And so it goes round in a circle. And in some ways, we actually sustain God or the mind of the universe.
Well, and I was specifically thinking of quantum mechanics when I brought up the idea of this kind of magical thinking, because just that belief somehow that you could have a dual existence. You could have something being particle-like and wave-like at the exact same time, or to go back effortlessly between the two things. I think that was really hard for mainstream science to accept when quantum physics was originally proposed. It seemed preposterous. But, now we know that actual kind of dual existence is very real, and that this was completely consistent with, I think, what those Renaissance-era Hermeticists would have been happy to accept.
Yes, and not just waves, that they can take two forms, the particles, but that the mind of the observer actually can change that. And not only change that in the present, but change that in the past. It gets very weird.
That's so magical. I mean,
yes, it is.
It's such a cool idea, but there's if you had to draw a plumb line for what is science, and above the plumb line is, this is right here, above this horizon line, this is pure science, and below it is pure magic. You'd be going back and forth and back and forth.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
you can't do it.
And these concepts of, that Lynn was just talking about, that the mind of the observer changing what you're observing, but also changing things that happened in the past, these are absolute sort of hard and fast bits of modern quantum physics. They're not, that they're not kind of something mystical or something new age. These are things that physicists talk about all the time and take for granted. You read Stephen Hawking; he talks about it, and you think, you're right. How much more magical can you get than that?
But actually, they're very careful, though, scientists, not to, draw conclusions or see implications for example, the paranormal, which annoys a lot of people, including me. It's fine for a subatomic particle to see into the future, but not a human being.
Well, and let's talk about the paranormal vis-a-vis these occultists, because at one time some things were considered paranormal, which now we would accept as science. Maybe not science that we can consistently do yet, but I think that there are already some. There's a dotted line between what we might consider to be psychology and parapsychology. But give me an example, as you see it, of things that are paranormal that would be consistent with the Hermeticists and this early group of people who are bringing back the Hermetica and then the problem with science treatment of that.
Pretty much anything paranormal fits into this Hermetic idea, because this concept of our consciousness being embedded into the universe in a very fundamental way, so that, as we observe the universe just by being here, we are helping to create and sustain it, is very much part of the Hermetic idea. And once you've got into that area, that there's an interaction between consciousness and matter at a very fundamental level is what it boils down to. Then you start thinking, then anything becomes possible, potentially. The barriers between past, present, and future begin to break down as they do at the quantum level. It's very kind of interesting, though. There's still a kind of mental block on the part of many scientists. Lynn earlier mentioned John Archibald Wheeler, one of the great physicists. He died a few years ago. One of the great physicists of the 21st century, is acknowledged by everyone as being a great thinker. He's the person that came up with the idea of black holes and wormholes and things like this, and developed this concept of the participatory universe. As we observe it, we create it. The same thing, John Archibald Wheeler was a huge opponent of parapsychology. When the Parapsychological Association joined was affiliated to the Scientific Academy, he opposed that. And you think, why? What Wheeler was actually saying is often much weirder, much more bizarre, much more paranormal than claims of ESP and precognition and that kind of thing. So it's strange. There's still that kind of skeptical attitude there. But of course, there's been very good evidence coming out from scientific research in the last few years that it is possible to react to things, human beings and some animals, has been shown that they react to things at least a few seconds before they actually happen.
Right.
So that boundary between past, present, and future breaks down, and once that does, anything becomes possible. At least
then what is normal? I mean, if you break that down, Lynn, you have a thought on that?
Well, I was just thinking that the basic Hermetic attitude is one of involvement, one of basically a holistic relationship. It's one of relationships, holistic relationship with nature, with the universe. Whereas scientists stand completely back and see nature as being a separate thing, often a separate thing to be beaten into submission, one has to say. But because the Hermeticists believe that everything has a soul, that this is a living universe, that consciousness, basically consciousness makes the universe, sustains the universe, and maintains a relationship with every living thing, then when you think about it, if the Hermeticists had continued and were, in power in science, then we wouldn't have the problem with the state of the planet that we have now.
Yeah, I mean, you really draw some different conclusions, I think, about what should and shouldn't be included as science. We're talking about the forbidden universe, the occult origins of science, and the search for the mind of God. Now, we haven't talked a lot about the search for the mind of God per se, although many modern scientists would be willing to use language like, God in terms of something ineffable, some animating life force that's out there, but not everybody would be comfortable with that. What do you mean when you talk about the early occultists, these hermeticists, and the search for the mind of God?
Well, essentially that was the quest. That that they always, Newton was trying to work out God's plan, the way God designed the universe. The more you find out about the universe, his attitude and those of the early scientists, the more you understood basically how God operated. Therefore, you learned something not just about the physical properties of the universe, but about the spiritual qualities. Famously, the phrase "search for the mind of God" actually comes from Stephen Hawking when he said that's the goal of modern science. The parallel between the Hermetic attitude and the modern scientific one, particularly the quantum physics one, the Hermetica looked upon the universe as being essentially a thought of the mind of God, is the way it would be put poetically. So everything in the universe is, in a way, part of God, part of the thought of God's mind, including ourselves. And so, therefore, the more that we discover about the universe, the more we're actually reuniting our own selves with that kind of divine spark that kicked the whole thing off. Again, it matches very closely what John Archibald Wheeler was saying about the fact that, us being here is what actually makes the universe. It's a very strong power. They're essentially saying the same things but in different language, as we keep pointing out in the second part of the book.
Right. And Lynn?
Well, I was just thinking there's an Austrian astrophysicist called Erich Jansch who says God is not the creator, but the mind of the universe. And that is literally Hermetic. I mean, that's just so Hermetic. So modern scientists, unknowingly or very largely unknowingly, are actually echoing now what the Hermeticists said.
Yeah, that's exactly kind of what I was thinking about, too. How often you hear scientists say the things which at one time they would have said, only, occult practitioners, only wizards would say those sorts of things. But now it seems like mainstream science again.
Exactly.
And I'll give you another example of that, and we'll get to it coming up in just a minute. I want to ask you about robots, and I want to ask you about organ donation. And I will tell you, because, again, I've been reading the book all week, The Forbidden Universe. A couple of those stories came up during the news, and I thought about them in context of these Hermeticists, the people that were reading the Hermetica, the people that we owe a great debt because they created modern science as we know it, except they didn't think they were doing that per se. They were creating magic. And you can find out more about that in the book, The Forbidden Universe. Link up to that through coasttocoastam.com. This is Ian Punnett. I was reading about so many early alchemists, burned at the stake that the song Fire from Ohio Players was going through my head all the time. It's awful. Especially the story of Bruno, who is really a very interesting, pivotal figure in the history of science. You'll read more about him in the Forbidden Universe. Oh, here's, I guess, another tie-in, too. Ohio Players, one of the greatest funk bands of all time, were on Mercury Records. And Mercury was another name for Hermes, which gives us the Hermetica. See, it all ties in together. And that's where we'll go back to the idea of the Hermetica and what it has inspired in science. Some of the ideas, the very earliest thoughts, which would have been, well, they were considered heretical. You would have gotten burned at the stake if you believed them. Many people did, and today we accept them as mainstream science. It was magical thinking that got us to where we are today, and you can read about that in the Forbidden Universe. And two of those ideas, robots and organ donation, coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, who are regular guests here on Coast to Coast, always putting out interesting books. The new one is no exception to that, worth a grab. And just out, too. You can link up to them through coasttocoastam.com. So as I was reading the book, I was thinking about two stories. First of all, that robots. And I thought, that's so, we forget, we take robots kind of for granted as a scientific concept. But really, the first time that robots are ever mentioned are in the Kabbalah. And the idea of taking clay and breathing life into it and creating a golem, that was a Kabbalistic idea. That was a concept that could have gotten you burned at the stake back then. And now the idea of making life in our image and likeness, now we're getting to a point where we may be in the near future be able to animate inanimate matter and create life in a test tube without anything. And that in itself, I just thought those are two examples of what would have been at one time considered magical thinking, which is just another day in the life in some lab somewhere.
Well, yes, we are sort of in a way coming full circle. I say these are things that would and did got people burnt to the stake. Just even coming up with the concept of it, but even simpler things. Just going back to where we started the show, talking about Leonardo and the shroud, which we believe was done by an early photographic technique. The reason we think Leonardo kept this technique secret is because experiments, even with optics projecting images, especially any attempt to try and capture images permanently. These were all regarded as things of the devil at the time, and people were punished. Contemporaries of Leonardo were punished for just doing simple things like projecting an image using what we'd call a magic lantern. So even very simple things like that. So imagine if those sort of basic things are being condemned and you're being persecuted for researching them. You can imagine what it would be like at that time if you're trying to do something even more profound, coming up with ideas of animating life, as you say.
Yes. Well, I mean, Leonardo, and by the way, we keep talking about Leonardo, and some people might wonder who he is. He's otherwise known as Da Vinci, right? Otherwise known as Da Vinci and wrongly known as Da Vinci. But anyway, it's Leonardo da Vinci. We call him Leonardo. He was actually, he and a lot of other artists at his time, they tried very hard to breathe life into their paintings in a magical sense, and especially in their sculptures. For example, Michelangelo said that you don't create an angel from a lump of stone as a sculptor. You free the angel from the stone. That was the way they thought. And they thought of paintings as being magical talismans. It was a huge sort of a whole different approach to today. But also Leonardo da Vinci, he did create a robot. He made an automaton, a mechanical soldier who banged a drum. And nobody knows much about it, but it's certainly true that he built that. He also built a walking lion, and I think it roared. And John Dee, who was Elizabeth I's astrologer and spy master and lots of other interesting things, he also was a Hermeticist, and he made, when he was a student, when he was very young, he made a flying beetle, a mechanical beetle. So the Hermetic thing encouraged people to think and to dare. That was the main thing. It encouraged them to dare and think outside the box, as we would say.
Yeah, and yet when you talk about the walking soldier, I remember seeing something about that a couple of years ago, and again, that was part of at a time when if you were making inventions which gave your patrons a military advantage, that was okay. But if you were gonna create an automaton that was going to follow around your very command, if you were going to be the creator and you were going to create life, well, we know what happens later on, just when in the novel Frankenstein, and we know what we can see right there, even just with that, if that reflected the zeitgeist of the times, that concept would have just was so terrifying to a certain both mainstream scientific worldview and a religious worldview that I think we're beyond that now. I think that maybe now that we're on the brink of being able to heal medical mysteries that have been plaguing us, through stem cell research, that when that actually happens, then we can see, this unlocks a whole nother aspect of science, which at one time would have been considered magical thinking. But it'll become mainstream science in no time.
Well, yes, and there are still opponents of that kind of research today.
But I think they're shrinking.
Usually on religious grounds, that these things shouldn't be able to happen.
Well, and I'm with you on that. I think that shrinks. I think kind of it's an ongoing process. I mean, I understand the religious belief on stem cell research. I get it. I have some people who feel very strongly about that in my life. However, it's sort of like the idea of test tube babies, and the idea that they would be born without a soul, and all it took is one person who had previously been against that, who only found being able to have a baby through in vitro fertilization, and suddenly then they're all for it. I think the same thing will happen perhaps with stem cell research, and that will reveal once more how something is migrated from what would have been magical, bizarre, pagan, occultish thinking into mainstream science.
Well, it's that other phrase that you hear, man can't play God. They're playing God by doing that. Now, the Hermetic thing is saying, actually, you can play God because, in a way, that's what God wants you to do.
That's an excellent point.
Attitude that's found in those books.
But also, sorry, Clive, the Hermetic thinking is not only man can play God, it's that man can play God because man is already more than half God. So we are God. We don't have to play God. And that could lead to all sorts of hugely irresponsible behaviour on the part of scientists. But actually, if they're Hermeticists, they won't be irresponsible, because with such power and such daring, such audacity, comes responsibility. And because the Hermeticists believe that, everything is part of us and we are part of everything, therefore we won't behave irresponsibly towards other people, towards animals, towards the planet. It all just fits in very neatly with Hermeticism.
Well, I think this is exactly what I was talking about when I was thinking about organ transplants, which at one time would have been considered playing God. Somebody's got a bad heart. Well, God wanted them to have a bad heart, and that was it. That was going to be it. They were going to die. But now the belief is, look at through the wonders of science, we can preserve life just like God would want us to do by having a transplant there and being able to preserve the life of somebody who goes on to do great things. And so it's a shift in the whole worldview, but it's a shift toward the Hermeticist.
It is, absolutely. We keep saying our culture is kind of rediscovering the original source of our culture scientifically, and it's something we to muse on and ponder on. That if that kind of artificial split had never happened, around the sort of to around the year sort of 1800-ish, 1700-ish, that this splitting apart, taking the magic and the method, scientific method, and then going in different directions. As we argue in the book, purely an accident of history. It wasn't suddenly people realizing that actually that we can take the best of this philosophy and get rid of the kind of occult nonsense. It was purely a sort of political expediency that made it happen. But if that hadn't have happened, where would we be now? Where would science have been? As Lynn was saying, it would probably there'd always have been a more sort of ethical centre to science, because it would recognise that we are connected not only to each other but to other species and to the planet as a whole, to the environment as a whole. So all the things that we're rediscovering, that we're trying to get back into science, respect for nature, realising that you can't just sort of waste resources, can't just use resources up without kind of replacing them. All that we think would always have been built into science right from the beginning. So we wouldn't have to be going through this huge process of rediscovery, both in terms of the actual principles of science, or the implications of it, the moral side to science.
Right.
So it's, I think modern science and modern society generally could do a lot worse than to go back to these books and rediscover them.
Yep. Again, we're talking about the forbidden universe, and the title itself is kind of ironic because nothing is forbidden to the Hermeticists, or is there? Is there anything about the time of this Renaissance in the interest in the Hermetica? Was there anything that would have been forbidden to them? Was there anything they would have looked down upon themselves for doing at the time?
Murder.
Murder.
Yes. I mean, yes. I mean, taking another life, stopping somebody from endeavouring to become God. That's everybody's destiny as far as they understood it. But of course, like everybody else, they're involved in wars, so they would kill people. But in cold blood, murder was definitely frowned upon. Yes.
But in battle, different thing.
Yeah. Anything destructive, anything that damaged the environment or other people, that would all have been forbidden to them, sort of morally, ethically. We were saying earlier, as Lynn was saying earlier, part of the imperative of people like Giordano Bruno was to try and find a way to stop the religious wars that were tearing Europe apart at that point. So it's a very moral philosophy as well. So in the sense, many acts are forbidden because anything that's destructive, anything that's harmful would just not be part of that their worldview at all. So it's not an anything goes philosophy, but
right.
It's an ask questions and challenge type kind of philosophy.
Well, I've been convalescing this week because I had about a 2.5 inch, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that, about a 2.5 inch bolt taken out of my right ankle, which they had to put in there to keep my foot attached to my leg. But it took a while for it to heal, and they took that out. So I've been sort of I was sitting on the porch and not moving much as I was reading the book, and I was thinking about. Oh, by the way, I should say thank you to the doctors of Summit Orthopedics for doing that. Great guys. But that's it. I mean, if there's spaceships flying overhead, and we're doing these sort of medical miracles all the time, we're wise to think about the kind of magical thinking that goes into science in the first place. So we're going to go to the phones coming up here in just a few minutes. We'll get a bunch of questions on for you. There's an aspect of this book which we've only barely touched on, and that's a little bit about secret societies. You've written about that extensively in other books, but it does surface a bit in the Forbidden Universe. We talked earlier about the Illuminati and then the organization that was based on the teachings of Bruno. But are there other examples of that where secret societies were able to carry on this knowledge even when it was being suppressed by the church?
Yes, I mean, we talked earlier about the Rosicrucians and sort of other
that's right.
Secret groups. One of the effects of this kind of splitting of the magic and the method that we talked about is that not only did sort of science reject the magical, the occult side, but to an extent it also happened the other way, that when Hermeticism became very much the province of the esoteric, the occult world, and for a long time that kind of rejected the science as well. So both sides lost. And again, in the 21st century, the two started to come together a lot more. So there were a lot of secret societies that called themselves Hermetic, but they were they were just looking at the kind of magical, spiritual side of it, not looking at the scientific method. But there are lots of pretty much every secret society from the 18th century onwards has a Hermetic component. Freemasonry adopted a lot of Hermetic philosophy. That's not to say that there's more stuff in Freemasonry than just the Hermeticism, but you find a lot of Hermetic ideas in Freemasonry. So, yes, it's a kind of common bond to pretty much every secret society from the 18th century onwards.
And the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, based in London. Lots of big names were involved in that, including the creator of Dracula, and just an astonishing range of people, including lots of women, because Hermeticism was actually quite egalitarian, which is, compared to the church, which put down women, this was quite remarkable.
Yeah, I think that's worthy of pointing out. And then, again, we'll get to your calls coming up in just a moment. I was reminded of George Washington Carver, right, the American inventor and pioneer into the rotation of crops. And I was reading something about him earlier that reminded me sort of Hermeticism as well. His personal philosophy, and this is what he went by. This is what he told his students about, was be clean both inside and out. Neither look up to the rich nor down on the poor. Lose if need be without crying. Win without bragging. Always be considerate of women, children, and older people. Be too brave to lie, too generous to cheat, and take your share of the world and let others take theirs. And I thought, he would have made a great Hermeticist.
Yes, he would. Yes. And you couldn't go wrong with that, could you?
No, I just like but when you actually see the philosophy of the Hermetica, then you really kind of start seeing it everywhere. It starts popping up in so many other places, and that is it's the beauty of the purity of that wisdom, the occult origins of science, and the search for the mind of God that went on from the Hermetica, which you can learn all about in the Forbidden Universe. We'll get to your questions and comments coming up. I want to thank, Bridge Builder, Thoris 64, and Healing Hands, Minnesota. These people put me over the top for 300 followers, 299, 300, and 301. And thank you, at Deacon Punnett, for my Twitter feed. And I've been tweeting during the show, but thank you for getting me. I just started doing it last week, and so thanks. We'll give you regular updates during the week on how guests are coming along. We'll include for that some observations on the news in between shows and this book I'm working on and personal stuff too. If you sign up for Twitter stuff, love to have you be a part of that. And I'm moving everybody onto a new Facebook fan page. If you're willing to make the jump, we'd appreciate that. All right, so your questions and comments coming up for Lynn and Clive next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett.